Morning, everybody. Peter, thanks for inviting me along to talk about this today. So, yes, I'm Jon Glerum. I work for Anglian Water. I lead on all our flood risk management related work. But I should probably say that I'm probably here wearing a Water UK hat as well today. So I chair Water UK's surface water management network, and Water UK have obviously led the work to create what is the DCG and what was the update for sewers for adoption. So I'll cover a bit of background about how we've got to this new DCG today. We'll look at some of the adoptable elements of SUDS that would fall under that, and some that won't. We'll look at some of the implementation stuff, and then some of my sort of final thoughts on where we're going to go next with it. So a bit of background. So this is a changed approach. So hopefully you're all really familiar with either one of these two documents, Sewers for Adoption 6 or 7. It didn't help that they were both available at the same time and were being used concurrently with each other because they had slightly different elements to them. So a decision was taken by Water UK to update Sewers for Adoption. So hence you will often hear about a lot of discussion about Sewers for Adoption 8. So Sewers for Adoption doesn't exist anymore. We are in a world where Sewers for Adoption is gone. The reason for that is because Ofwat decided to introduce what's called a code for adoption. Now, this covers both water and water recycling assets, so sewage assets. And the onus was on Water UK to develop guidance that would meet that code for adoption. And the idea originally was that Sewers for Adoption 8 would be that guidance. And back in April 2018, we released a pre-implementation version of Sewers for Adoption. And aligned with that, we produced some sector guidance which helped explain to people what the differences were within the new guidance. So now, that then changed when Ofwat approved what is now called the Design and Construction Guidance. There it is, the most exciting cover of a document ever. So that is available on the Water UK website. Both that and the one on the right there you can view. That's a lot easier to read, as you can imagine, whereas this is the technical, what was basically Sewers for Adoption, but is now a design and construction guide. And that meets Ofwat's requirements to provide guidance to meet the code for adoption. Now, why am I standing here? What's different? Well, there's some pretty major differences in there. Most notably, what is a sewer? So, for a lot of us, we would think these things are what we would think of as sewers. So, pipes, whether they're old clay pipes or beautiful brick sewers, hidden under London somewhere, for example. But whilst we were updating Sewers for Adoption, Water UK took some legal advice around whether SUDS or certain SUDS could be classified as a sewer. And with that in mind, all of those things can now be classified as sewers, for example. And my point here is it doesn't have to be a pipe underground. That's the key thing. And that's probably what a lot of us would have thought in the past with a sewer, is a pipe buried underground, out of sight, out of mind, thank you very much. But it's not. The advice we got from two separate QCs was that SUDS, or certain types of SUDS, could be or classified as sewers, and therefore they could be adopted under Section 104 as a sewer, formally as a sewer. So there are some specific criteria with regards to this, though, and I'll just run through these quickly because this is the important bit, because not all SUDS can be sewers. So these are, I suppose, what we would call the kind of the sort of positive principles, and for a SUD component, or for that matter, a pipe under the ground, it has to meet these four things. So it has to be constructed to drain buildings and yards appurtenant to buildings. That's the terms in the legislation. And it must serve more than one property, so 2 or more properties. It must have a channel. So that's basically a depression between banks or ridges or a defined boundary of some description. It must convey and return flow to either a sewer or to the environment, either a surface water body or groundwater. And it must have an effective point of discharge. And Bronwyn, you made this point earlier. This is really, really important. There must be lawful authority to discharge back into the environment, whether that's a watercourse or groundwater. So, and that is not for the water company to do, that is for the applicant to do. They must get that permission to get that discharge, and then that would then be transferred to the water company in due course after adoption. So if you meet those 4 things, it can be adopted. Obviously, there are things that would exclude certain SUDs from being adopted. So it can't be part of a watercourse or form part of a watercourse as defined in law, so as you would normally expect, rivers, streams, etc. It can't be developed to primarily drain the highway. Again, it can't be designed to primarily deal with groundwater. It can't form the structure of a building, and it can't form the structure of a road. So if any of those things, so you've got some examples there of a green roof on a building, clearly that is the roof of the building. It's clearly a structural component of the building. Same with the road, clearly the top surface, if it's a permeable paved road, is clearly part of the highway. So in that case, they would not be adoptable. So what does that leave us in terms of those components that are therefore adoptable? So, and all of the examples I've chosen here, I've just gone through the list within the DCG. So hopefully I've not missed anything. So swales would be adoptable. And I should say, as I go through these, you'll see there's one obvious omission of what is adoptable, and I'll see if anyone picks up on it afterwards. So we would be looking, when we're looking to adopt a swale, at taking on, or the adoptable bits up the sides and the base of the channel and any vegetation that forms a drainage function within that. So, and I also should say that Bronwyn, you made this point earlier as well, any design, we would be looking for the designer to be using the SUDS manual, Syria's SUDS manual. So you'll see throughout the DCG there's constant references to Syria documents for particularly the SUDS manual, but also later around geocellular systems too. So the DCG is not a detailed guidance document. It will always refer to what is best practice guidance out there, and in this case, clearly it's a SUDS manual. So rills are adoptable. Clearly there's a channel there if it serves more than 2 properties, and it's not solely draining the highway, for example, then that is potentially adoptable. Bioretention systems, so these can be kind of engineered systems with engineered soil, for example, to increase infiltration. So it could be some form of sort of rain garden, it could be a tree pit. There's different ways of doing that, obviously. And we'll look at different adoptable features within that. Ponds and wetlands are adoptable, assuming there is an inlet and an outlet. Clearly that forms a channel. If it's a pond with no outlet and no infiltration, it's not going to be adoptable. And if it's just a natural occurring pond, it's probably not going to be adoptable either. So, basins, so we'll look at both infiltration basins and attenuation basins. Slightly different, obviously, but we will look at both. Clearly, for the obvious reason that infiltration will be discharging back to the ground. And as we talked about earlier, as part of that sort of positive criteria, that is adoptable. So we will still look at underground features too, so tanks, obviously, so whether that's oversized pipes or crate systems. Our preference would be, obviously, for them to be online systems. That's as it's explained within the DCG. And as I mentioned, particularly if you're looking at designing geocellular systems, then those need to be, you need to use the Syria guidance to deliver that. So, infiltration trenches and filter drains would also be adoptable. But in this case, we would expect there to be some form of perforated pipe underneath these features that allow us, 1, to provide maintenance, and 2, for that water to drain away appropriately. So And then finally, although it doesn't form a channel, certain soakaways would be adoptable as well as an ancillary to the sewer. So now the key thing here is, again, it obviously has to serve more than one property. And when we look at the potential adoption for soakaways, there needs to be an element of allowing maintenance to be undertaken. So if they're all stuck in people's back gardens, we're probably not going to want to adopt them because we can't maintain them. Or if we do maintain them, we're going to have to knock down everyone's fences and drive a digger in there, which is not going to go down particularly well. So these sorts of things that need to be thought about as part of that process. So, and then DCG also talks about the outfall structures and control structures that could be included within those systems. So whether above or below ground. So those are the things that are adoptable. Anyone notice the one thing that I missed out? No, this is not adoptable. I'll explain why in a minute. Pipes. I didn't mention pipes, and deliberately so, but because I wanted to test you all. So clearly, traditional pipe under the ground is still adoptable as a normal surface water sewer. There's nothing really changed there. All the guidance remains within the DCG that you would have found within sewers for adoption. Private suds, permeable paving was mentioned a minute ago. So these are not adoptable. Often because they're only serving one property, so it doesn't meet the criteria we talked about earlier, or they form part of the structure of that property, for example. So in those cases, those would not be adoptable. Those would remain the responsibility for, if it's just sitting within the household boundary, it remains the responsibility for the homeowner. If that permeable paving is out on the highway, then it's clearly the responsibility of the highway authority if it's an adopted road. Make that point. Okay, so there we go. So that is everything that's included within the DCG for adoption. So implementation. Bronwyn put this far better than I could have done before. We need to work together to do this. The reason being is that at the end of the day, planning has the majority of the power here to ensure that we deliver a lot of this stuff. So, Sam, you talked about National NPPF, which now expects SUDs to be delivered as a first preference, clearly a priority to do that, which is great, but it's not within our realm to make sure the developer does that. That's up to the local planning authority to make sure that happens. So, we also don't have a right to refuse connection onto our system. So as Bronwyn mentioned earlier, this right to connect, the right to connect to surface water systems remains because that wasn't removed as part of the Schedule 3 work. So really we rely on the local planning authority in particular, but also the relationship that we have with the lead local flood authority to make sure the applicants are looking at the hierarchy, the control to the receiving water bodies, the rates of discharge, and making sure that we're actually delivering good quality SUDs. So really, really important. Equally, the engagement that we have in particular with the highway authorities will be really important. And it's difficult to make out on this diagram here, but there are swales that run along the side of the highways, which discharge into this open space here, which will be a basin. But there's also a lot of permeable pavement there as well. And without that engagement with the highway authority, who would take on, hopefully, if they're willing to adopt it, the permeable paving, whilst we probably take on the swales in the basin, it's going to fall down. So there needs to be that really good engagement to make sure that kind of stuff happens. We also need to make sure that the hierarchy is followed as best as possible. Now, one of the really good changes that has come into the DCG is the fact that they've added a new tier to the hierarchy, which is about surface water runoff is collected for use within the household. That wasn't in the previous version of Sewers for Adoption. So in this case, it's about recycling that water back into the house, and I think that's a really good move to go in that direction. So, and then the rest of the hierarchy remains the same as it has always been. So, also the extent of the adoption. So there was a question when we were developing the DCG around what would the extent of the adoption be, and should it be the 1 in 30 plus climate change, which is where water companies have normally sat, particularly in terms of pipe systems, or should it be something else? and we decided that actually it would sit at the 1 in 100 plus climate change, because that's generally the standard that we're looking to deliver through the planning process. And also, if we're going in to maintain this asset and decide to only cut the grass halfway up the bank, well, that's a bit daft in the end of the day, isn't it? So actually, it makes far more sense to create a system where we're adopting up to the edge of the banks, so taking the 1 in 100. It also, from my perspective, it makes my system more resilient as well. So in the past, I've dealt with the 1 in 30s, but actually now I'm able to adopt systems that deal with the 1 in 100. Well, that's great for me because that helps me deal with climate change in the future. So that's really good. And then I thought I'd just put a slide in here about recent adoptions. So Bronwyn also mentioned some other water companies that are looking really hard in this space at the minute. We ourselves, at Anglian Water, are quite lucky. We've offered adoption of SUDs since 2012. So we're probably further along the line in terms of our processes than others might be. And here are just a few examples of some that we've adopted over the last year or so. So as you can see, basins with gentle slopes and lots of public open space, ease of maintenance, etc. So all the things that we've been talking about, which is, will help us to deliver and adopt these things going forward. So that's it pretty much. I'll just finish on some kind of final sort of considerations that I think we need to probably all bear in mind as we're working through this. So as Peter mentioned, the DCG, although it's all published online at the moment and you can download it from the Water UK website, it comes into effect on the 1st of April this year. So, and that is a big change, particularly for our developer services teams within the water companies, but it's also a big change for all of our partners that we're going to work with, because this is a new element of adoption. So whilst you look at a nice picture of a SUD scheme, I think in London somewhere, I'll just reflect on some of the things that I think we need to consider. So one, the implementation of this will take time to become business as usual. So both internally, as we train up our teams, and there's some training that will be commencing later this month, being led by SciWem and Syria, to train all the developer services teams across all of the water companies. They'll all get the same training. But wherever possible, we want to try and roll that out to bring our partners into some of that as well. So, but it will take time for some of this to bed in. So, this is also a huge kind of step forward. So for water companies to kind of put our hands in the ring and say, look, we'll offer the adoption of these. Adoption is always flagged as the key issue that stops SUDs from being delivered and adopted. We find a solution, potentially. Will that deliver the change that we're all hoping for or not? We'll wait and see what happens on that, I think. So we need to better align our processes, particularly during planning, and we've talked about that. Both Bronwyn and myself have talked about the engagement at pre-planning of water companies and so forth. Also, the alignment with our lead local flood authorities and making sure we're saying the same thing back to the lead local planning authority, for example. So that's really important. And then one thing I haven't mentioned, but is a critical point, is it is mandatory for the water companies to follow the DCG. It is not mandatory for the developer to offer their SUDs and sewers to the water company for adoption. The developer can basically do what they like. They can keep them themselves, they can offer them to a management company, whatever they want. So there's no requirement for them to do that. So clearly there's a benefit of them doing that because they've got an obvious route for adoption here. So, but that is possibly a shortfall at the moment, that we still might be in a place where we're going to have lots of management companies looking after these things, and we all know what can happen to those at a later date. So I've talked about the right to connect. Ideally, we need to remove that right to connect so we have more power and control over what gets discharged into our systems. And the national non-statutory technical standards still remain in place, and they are being updated. They don't necessarily support or reflect the changes that we've gone through in terms of the DCG. So we've obviously got a chance to change that, but that's going to be work in progress. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. And obviously, any questions, please?